A dim hallway light flickers as he smiles at me like nothing is collapsing. The courthouse corridor narrows around us, its pale walls reflecting an anemic glow. Each time the flickering bulb above us stutters. The uneven flashes carve his face into alternating halves, one moment cool confidence, the next, a shadowed distortion of the man I once thought I understood. I stand still, feeling the chilled air seep through the seams of my jacket, each breath shallow but steady enough to hold me upright. The scent of old paper lingers mixed with the muted bitterness of overbrewed coffee drifting from an open office door. A bailiff strides past his shoes, clicking sharply, and the sound reverberates through my ribs like a countdown. My fingers twitch near my side, a reflexive gesture from years of holding back words that needed to be spoken. He steps closer, his polished shoes gliding over the linoleum floor, and the shift of his body blocks part of the glow from the flickering bulb. The partial shadow stretches toward me, halved, like the truth we're both pretending isn't about to detonate. "We should go in," he murmurs softly, voice leveled and composed. The calmness he projects is almost theatrical, the same tone he used whenever he wanted to assure friends or coworkers that everything was perfectly normal. It used to work on me too, until the inconsistencies began stacking like fragile glass towers, waiting for the wrong breath to send them shattering. I don't move. I study him the way one studies a reflection they no longer recognize, slowly, cautiously collecting the details that don't align. His tie is neatly knotted, but slightly off-center. His cufflink is polished, but turned just a fraction too far, as if he fastened it hastily. A bead of sweat, almost imperceptible, traces a quiet path near his temple, despite the cool air. The flickering bulb catches it intermittently, turning the small droplet into a glint of exposed fear. My own reflection ghosts faintly on the courtroom door's narrow glass panel eyes, sharp jaw set, posture rigid enough to withstand the storm we're walking into. I feel the years pressing behind my ribs, all the moments I minimized, all the signs I absorbed privately. I remember hearing the soft buzz of that same type of bulb in our kitchen, the night he lied about being stuck in traffic, the hum of electricity blending with the tightness in his voice. It feels fitting that another unsteady light frames him now, exposing the seams in his controlled demeanor. He attempts another smile, thinner this time, the kind that stretches at the wrong angle. "Let's not make this harder," he says. "Harder for whom?" The word lands between us like a dropped coin, small, metallic, echoing with selfish weight. People pass around us in muted waves, paralegals flipping through files, attorneys whispering strategies, the distant shuffle of paperwork echoing from deeper inside the courthouse. Their movements surround us but do not touch us. We've been isolated in our silent implosion far too long. I shift my gaze toward the courtroom door, noticing how the faint reflection of the flickering bulb fractures across the metal handle, each oscillation breaking the light into uneven shards. The sound of footsteps approaches from behind, lighter, hesitant, familiar. Lily must be close. I don't turn to look. I feel her presence, the quiet gravity she carries, even when she tries to shrink herself small. The weight of whatever she's been hiding sits heavily between us, a presence more urgent than the trembling bulb overhead. I inhale, letting the cold air settle inside me before speaking. My voice emerges steady, edged with the clarity that comes after too many nights of drowning in doubt. Some truths don't stay buried just because you want them to. He blinks the first visible crack in his practiced composure. The hum of the flickering bulb intensifies for a moment, casting a brief, elongated shadow across his jaw. I don't elaborate. I don't need to. The hall feels as though it tilts slightly, as if the building itself anticipates impact. He opens his mouth to respond, then closes it again, choosing silence, a tactic he's used countless times to redirect guilt. It won't work today. A bailiff opens the courtroom door wider, calling our names with a practiced neutrality. The shift sends a thin draft sweeping through the corridor, stirring the edges of my jacket, and carrying the scent of polished wood and legal gravity. I catch sight of Lily's reflection in the glass panel before I see her directly. She's holding her cracked phone, close her fingers tight around the edges, as though she's protecting something fragile but powerful. She meets my eyes with a quiet resolve that steadies something deep inside me. We step forward. The flickering bulb gives one last sputtering pulse of light, splitting his face cleanly again. One half brightness, one half shadow, before stabilizing into a weak, steady glow. The moment freezes just long enough to etch itself into memory. The truth always waits for the right light to reveal itself. My heartbeat steadies. My hand touches the cool surface of the courtroom door. And with the hallway's fractured glow behind us and an unspoken storm ahead, we walk inside. The last flicker of the bulb fades behind me, like a shutter closing on the life I'm finally ready to expose. The morning before everything began unraveling had seemed almost ordinary, one of those deceptively calm days that tempted me into believing life still held its shape. I was Evelyn Hart, 41 years old, a paralegal from Portland, Oregon. And back then I had convinced myself that stability was something you could secure simply by refusing to look at its cracks. The cracked phone sat on our kitchen counter that day, its fractured screen catching the muted winter light in sharp angles that scattered across the table. Lily kept placing it face down whenever Eric entered the room, her movements quick but subtle enough that I almost missed the urgency behind them. A thin shadow divided across the floor as sunlight filtered through the half-closed curtain. A single line stretched between us like a boundary I hadn't realized existed. Eric stood by the sink, sipping coffee with the same practiced calm he wore to work. His shoulders relaxed, his tie perfectly aligned, every piece of him arranged for visual confidence. I watched him rinse the mug, noticing how he avoided meeting my eyes, how his gestures felt measured in a way that suggested he had already rehearsed the version of himself he wanted us to see. Lily hovered near the doorway, her hoodie sleeves pulled over her palms, glancing at her phone with attention that didn't belong on a 15-year-old's face. I asked her if the phone was acting up again, and she shrugged, her voice thin, as she said she would deal with it later. Later never came, not then. I remember Eric's voice from that morning, smooth and rehearsed, telling me he'd be working late. He placed a quick kiss on my cheek, the gesture mechanical, devoid of warmth, the kind of affection used to maintain appearances. I wanted to believe him because disbelief would have required confrontation, and confrontation meant acknowledging how long I had been quiet. Sometimes silence becomes a prison disguised as peace. After he left the house, felt different, heavier. Lily retreated to her room, closing the door with a softness that felt intentional, like she was afraid sound itself might trigger something. I stayed in the kitchen, staring at the cracked phone. The screen reflected my face in a mosaic of irregular shapes, the distorted lines revealing a version of me I barely recognized, tired, stretched thin, holding onto a structure that had already begun collapsing. I picked it up, turning it in my hand, feeling the small jagged ridge where the glass had chipped. Lily returned, suddenly snatching it from my palm with a speed that startled me. She apologized quickly, saying it contained personal stuff. She wasn't lying, but she wasn't telling the truth either. That became a pattern: small omissions, quick glances, tense silences. At the time, I told myself adolescence looked different now that technology made privacy a fragile thing. But underneath that rationalization lived a quiet knowing I wasn't ready to bring to the surface. Eric texted me around noon, a message too cheerful for a man claiming to be overwhelmed at work. His tone never matched his claimed exhaustion. It felt like he performed both for different audiences. When he came home later than usual, the air around him carried a scent unfamiliar, a mix of cold night wind and something metallic, almost chemical. He set his keys on the counter, avoiding the space where the cracked phone had been earlier. Lily watched him from the hallway, her expression unreadable. I asked how work had gone, and he replied with a short clip summary: traffic delays, a late meeting. His answers arrived too quickly, like stones skipping across water, rather than sinking into truth. That night after Lily went to bed, he lingered in the hallway near the mirror, adjusting his collar. His reflection fractured slightly, where the bulb above flickered, and the wavering image made him look like two men overlapping, one calm, one strained. He caught me watching and forced a soft smile. "Everything's fine when you stop looking for trouble." He told me, his tone gentle, but edged with something colder. I nodded, the reflex built from years of trying to avoid unnecessary fights. But deep inside, something quiet shifted, like a lock turning. Later, as I washed a few lingering dishes, I glanced toward the living room and saw it again, the thin shadow dividing the floor, marking a boundary between truth and the version we pretended to inhabit. The house, once familiar, felt subtly rearranged, as though honesty itself had begun peeling away in layers only I could feel. Eric went to bed early, claiming exhaustion. Lily stayed awake longer, pacing softly in her room. I heard the small click of her phone camera, the script of a secret she wasn't ready to share. None of us slept well that night. We moved around each other like actors trapped in roles we no longer believed in. And looking back, I realized that day was the last moment I could pretend not to see the warning forming quietly inside the fissures of our lives. It was the final breath before the truth began forcing its way to the surface. The fracture began quietly, the way a hairline crack spreads through glass long before anyone notices it weakening. It was a Thursday afternoon, the sky over our neighborhood, a flat gray that felt more like an unfinished sentence than weather. I came home early from work, hoping to get ahead on some case files, and stepped into a house that felt strangely paused. The first thing I noticed was the silver key resting on top of a stack of unopened mail, its metallic surface catching what little light slipped through the living room window. It wasn't one of ours. The keys we used were plain brass worn from years of handling. This one was heavier, colder, with front scratches near the teeth, as though it had been repeatedly forced into a lock that resisted. I picked it up, feeling its unfamiliar weight press into my palm. A subtle chill traveled up my arm, something instinctive and immediate, the kind of intuitive warning you recognize only in hindsight. When Eric came home later, he spotted the key instantly. His eyes flicked to it with the sharpness he tried to disguise beneath a casual tone. He claimed it belonged to an old storage unit he needed to clean out, but something about the way he said it, too quick, too rehearsed, made the explanation feel more like a reflex than truth. I placed the key down without pressing him, though a tension settled in the air, thin but unmistakable. That evening, while preparing dinner, I walked past our shared computer and saw the screen lit with an open email tab. Eric usually stayed meticulous about logging out of everything. The subject line caught my eye first. JN12 follow-up required. My pulse tightened. I clicked. The email was stamped with a recent date and time one that didn't match the story he'd given me about being stuck in traffic. Inside the message, the wording was clipped and purposeful, referencing the next meeting missing documents, and a final line that chilled me more than I wanted to admit. Be more careful this time. There was nothing intimate about the tone, nothing overtly incriminating, but the timestamp alone contradicted his alibi so precisely it felt like a pin pushed directly into the balloon of every excuse he'd offered over the past weeks. Sometimes a lie doesn't scream, it just quietly refuses to match the facts. The realization didn't detonate, it settled slow and heavy the way fog rolls in from the coast. I scrolled further, noticing that the sender's name was partially redacted, replaced by an abbreviated set of initials I didn't recognize. The email thread contained earlier exchanges, all brief, with references to documents Eric never mentioned. I knew his work well enough to detect when something didn't fit, and nothing in this thread aligned with the version of his job he routinely described. A sound behind me made me jump. Lily stood in the doorway, watching me with an expression that flickered between fear and relief. She asked what I was looking at, and when I explained, her shoulders stiffened. She clutched her cracked phone tightly in her hand, knuckles draining of color. For a moment, it looked as though she might say something, confess something, but she swallowed hard and told me she had homework. Her retreat down the hall felt unnatural, like she was fleeing a room filling with smoke. Shortly afterward, Eric walked in, his footsteps too deliberate. His gaze tracked from the computer screen to my face, and something still and calculating settled behind his eyes. I told him I'd seen an email open accidentally. He laughed, too light, too bright for the tension. He claimed it was an old archived message from last year that must have bounced forward into his inbox. But the timestamp glowed on the screen, undeniable in its clarity. When I asked him about the discrepancy, he offered explanations with a fluid ease that unsettled me more than the email itself. His hand reached for the mouse a second too fast as he closed the window, as if contact with the evidence might burn him. Lily lingered near the corner of the hallway, half hidden, watching him, watching me, her cracked phone gripped like a secret. Eric dismissed the email again, brushing off its importance, but beneath his calm demeanor, something shook. His fingers tapped silently against his thigh, a subtle rhythmic tension. I realized then that I had spent years learning his patterns, his micro-expressions, his shifts in tone, all the quiet cues that reveal more than spoken words. And everything about him in that moment aligned perfectly with one truth: he was lying. Later, after he went to bed, I returned to the computer. The screen was dark. The email was gone, deleted. But deletion, I knew all too well, wasn't the same as erasure. Truth doesn't vanish just because someone buries the evidence. I sat alone in the dim glow of the kitchen, the silver key in front of me, its cold shine pulsing faintly beneath the overhead light. The house felt hollow, cavernous, the distance between our rooms weighted with unspoken questions. A storm had begun forming, quietly gathering its shape in shadows and contradictions, and though I didn't yet know the full scale of what Lily was carrying or what Eric was hiding, I felt the fracture spreading. And this time I didn't look away. The courtroom felt colder than the hallway, a cavern of polished wood and restrained authority where every sound seemed amplified and every lie carried weight. The dim lamp positioned near Judge Monroe's bench cast a low amber halo that failed to warm the room. Instead, it illuminated floating dust particles that drifted in and out of the thin beam like suspended moments waiting to be judged. I sat beside my attorney, my hands clasped tightly enough to ache, listening to Eric weave the same careful narrative he had been rehearsing for weeks. His voice carried a calm cadence that had convinced so many before: neighbors, co-workers, even some of our friends, but today it felt thinner, as though stretched too tightly over something cracking beneath the surface. I studied him the way I used to examine case files, looking for the inconsistency that would eventually reveal the truth. He leaned forward as he spoke, gesturing with a confidence that seemed choreographed. Each statement he gave painted me as a neglectful spouse, a woman who created storms out of nothing, a partner who couldn't maintain a stable home. His attorney nodded along rhythmically, reinforcing the image with practiced solemnity. Lily sat quietly behind me, her cracked phone nestled between her hands, her knuckles white with pressure. Every so often she glanced toward Eric, as though bracing for the moment he might notice her determination. My attorney kept his eyes forward, awaiting. When Judge Monroe asked if there were additional statements or evidence, the room stilled. Eric leaned back, confident in his illusion of control. He didn't see Lily rise behind us. Her chair scraped against the floor with a sharp slicing sound that spliced through the silence like a blade. She stepped forward, her voice steady as she requested permission to present evidence. The judge regarded her with mild surprise before nodding for her to proceed. Lily walked to the front of the courtroom, her hand trembling slightly as she unlocked her phone. She navigated through her files until she reached the one labeled HV04. The moment that thumbnail appeared, Eric's posture changed. He sat up straighter, his jaw tightening, and his attorney whispered a fast, panicked question under his breath. Lily pressed play. The courtroom's overhead speakers crackled softly before the image filled the mounted screen at the front of the room. The video began with dim lighting our living room, its familiar angles casting a heavy ache through my chest. Eric stood in the center, pacing in jagged arcs, while speaking in a tone I had never heard directed fully at me, but which Lily had quietly endured. He spoke sharply, angrily, spitting blame at shadows in the room. The sound was raw, unguarded, revealing a temperament he'd kept tightly masked in public, reserved only for moments he thought no one could witness. Sometimes the truth isn't hidden. It's simply waiting for someone brave enough to hold it up to the light. A murmur rippled through the courtroom, a mix of disbelief and discomfort. Eric shot to his feet, objecting with sudden ferocity, but Judge Monroe raised a hand, silencing him. She leaned forward slightly, eyes narrowing as she watched him through the dim lamp's glow, assessing him with the precision she had sharpened over years on the bench. Lily's voice broke through the tension as she explained why she recorded the video, that she feared no one would believe her mother without proof. Her words cracked open something inside me, a mixture of grief and gratitude so profound it nearly buckled my breath. Eric's attorney sputtered, attempting to argue the video was taken out of context, but the more he spoke, the more the reality on the screen contradicted every crafted narrative Eric had built. The judge paused the video halfway through, staring at the frozen frame where Eric's face twisted in anger, illuminated by the dim lamp's flicker that matched the one in the recording. She asked Eric directly to explain the footage. He stammered, eyes wide, and for the first time that day his composure faltered so visibly the entire room saw the fracture. Lily remained still, the cracked phone lowered, but secure in her grasp, her courage radiating through the space between us. She looked at me briefly, and in that moment, everything unspoken passed between us, years of fear, silence, and finally truth finding its way into a room big enough to hold it. Lies crumble fastest when held against their own reflections. Judge Monroe declared the video admissible and ordered it replayed from the beginning. I sat, frozen breath thin, as the reality of what Lily had done settled around me. She had carried the truth quietly, waiting for the moment she believed it would matter most. The courtroom shifted the balance of power, reorienting itself not through anger or accusation, but through the undeniable weight of evidence. And as the video played once more under the dim lamp's unwavering glow, I realized we had crossed a threshold no lie could undo. The courtroom's air felt heavier after the video ended, as though the walls themselves had absorbed something they could never release. When Judge Monroe called for a short recess, the room shifted into a murmur of hushed conversations and averted stares. I stayed seated for a moment, my mind replaying the hard edges of the footage, the sound of Eric's voice cracked open by his own anger. It was as if the room had been split into two worlds before the video and after it, and nothing about the latter felt remotely familiar. I walked into the hallway, the atmosphere thick with the scent of old varnish and the low hum of distant footsteps. A fragment of a broken compact mirror, something that must have fallen from someone's purse, glinted near the bench by the drinking fountain. I reached out, lifting the tiny mirror shard between my fingers. It reflected my face in a sliver, cutting it into uneven symmetry. The fractured reflection felt unsettlingly accurate, matching the emotional dissonance inside me. Everything looked like me, yet none of it felt whole. Lily joined me, sitting down cautiously, her cracked phone clutched in her lap. Her shoulders sagged with a mixture of relief and fear, as though the weight of the secret she had carried was finally shifting, but not fully lifted. I told her she had been brave, and she nodded, her eyes glassy, staring down at the floor. My attorney approached with a subtle urgency, lowering his voice as he explained that the video had changed everything, but something else wasn't lining up. He asked if I remembered the night Eric claimed he'd been at an early meeting, the one he swore occurred at 4:02 a.m. As he spoke, a memory surfaced, the faint blue glow on the kitchen wall that night, subtle, but too focused to come from a passing car. I had dismissed it back then, attributing it to headlights drifting through our window, a mistake I now realized was part of a pattern. He handed me a printed image, evidence number 3, a timestamp glitch captured when Lily had shown him the metadata from the video earlier. The modification time read 0317, not just 4:02. The numbers stood side by side, contradicting each other cleanly and without forgiveness. Sometimes the smallest numbers dismantle the biggest lies. I stared at the digits until they blurred slightly, the mirror shard still warm between my fingers. It struck me then that truth often hides not in sweeping revelations, but in the precise moments where details refuse to align. The discrepancy was small, but it carried the weight of an entire unraveling. Eric re-entered the hallway a few minutes later, his expression a brittle mask of regained composure. He pretended not to see me as he passed, but his jaw tightened at the edges, his posture stiff with a tension he could no longer conceal. His attorney trailed behind him, speaking in a rapid whisper, gesturing emphatically toward the printed screenshot in his hands. I watched them, noticing how Eric's face shifted between irritation and panic, each flicker exposing the cracks beneath. Lily sat still, her gaze following him cautiously, her fingers tightening around her phone. She leaned closer to me, whispering that she remembered hearing him leave the house much earlier that night, long before the time he claimed. Her voice trembled slightly at the memory. The timestamp glitch solidified everything. It wasn't just digital noise. It was the kind of mistake people make when they try to stitch lies into a seamless story, but forget how truth tends to preserve itself in the margins. The recess ended, and we returned to the courtroom, the dim lighting guiding us back to our separate seats. Eric refused to look at me, as he sat down, focusing instead on a point somewhere near the judge's bench, as though ignoring me might help contain the collapse. "A lie can survive doubt, but it can't survive precision," my attorney whispered as we waited for the judge. Judge Monroe reviewed the evidence again, her gaze sharp as it moved from the printed timestamp to the file description. She asked Eric directly why the times didn't match his testimony. He inhaled sharply, searching for a plausible narrative, but the room had shifted too far from his control. His explanation, something about syncing issues and late-night work uploads, fell flat, thinner than the air around us. The judge's brows lowered, skepticism settling heavily across her features. The timestamp contradiction wasn't damning by itself, but it created a fissure in the foundation of his story. Combined with the video, it widened into something undeniable. Eric's attorney attempted damage control, insisting that digital inconsistencies were common, but the judge stopped him mid-sentence, reminding him that the burden of clarity belonged to them, not the court. Lily leaned forward, silent but attentive, watching her father with an expression I had never seen on her before. Not anger, not fear, but recognition. It was as though she was finally seeing him without the careful framing he had constructed around his image. I felt something inside me shift then. A slow, cold clarity seeped into the spaces where fear had once lived. The mirror shard slipped from my fingers onto the table, its sharp edge catching a final beam of courtroom light before settling flat. The contradiction in the timestamps was the first solid proof that Eric's narrative was collapsing under its own weight. And for the first time in years, I felt the truth aligning in my favor. The courtroom felt colder when we returned from the recess, as though the temperature had dropped in anticipation of what came next, and I could sense a kind of brittle tension clinging to every surface, waiting to fracture. Eric sat with the rigid shoulders, his jaw set in a way that made it clear he was recalculating the narrative he thought he controlled. My attorney leaned toward me, his voice low, as he murmured that the timestamp discrepancy had opened a path, but the next step would cut deeper. A faint smell of a stale cigarette ash drifted from the disposal tray near the witness stand, a scent oddly sharp in a room that prided itself on sterility, and I watched a thin curl of ash loosen from the tray's edge, suspended briefly before collapsing. It reminded me of the fragile nature of lies, how they could cling for a moment but would always fall under their own weight. Judge Monroe signaled for the proceedings to continue, her expression flat yet attentive, as she invited my attorney to present anything further. He nodded, rising with calm deliberation, and introduced evidence number 4. The courtroom screens lit up again, their glow washing the wood panel walls in cold bluish tones. The first image appeared a screenshot labeled A87. I recognized the interface immediately. It was Eric's messaging app, though the captured conversation was incomplete, cut off mid-sentence. The timestamp indicated that the message was sent during a time he claimed he had been asleep, and the muted, abrupt ending suggested something more deliberate than a simple pause. My attorney walked the judge through the log. The messages ended sharply, then nothing for nearly 2 hours, followed by a single reply at a time that contradicted every piece of his sworn testimony. I watched Eric's face as the judge examined the screenshot. His eyes darted from the evidence to the screen, then down to his folded hands, the subtle tremble in his fingers betraying him, even as he forced his breathing into an even rhythm. "Truth doesn't shake, only the one trying to outrun it does," my attorney whispered. When the judge asked for an explanation, Eric inhaled too sharply, his voice hitting a brittle edge, as he insisted the silence was normal, that he often muted his phone at night, that the discrepancy meant nothing. But even as he spoke, his eyes flicked toward Carla, seated several rows behind him. Her expression had drained of color, and she stared downward, avoiding both of us. Something shifted in her posture, a stiffness that read like someone bracing just before impact. My attorney zoomed in on the messages, pointing out the unnatural silence, how the abrupt gap matched none of his prior patterns. Eric's voice grew harsher as he denied everything, each sentence arriving faster, his cadence cracking beneath the strain. Judge Monroe remained unreadable as she examined the screen. Then the courtroom's projector flickered for a moment, a soft glitch that sent a thin line of distorted light across the surface. The movement threw a warped reflection that split across the image, and I felt something inside me tighten as the motif echo surfaced in perfect clarity. The shadow split sharper across the glowing screen. The line drifted through my mind like a warning I had misunderstood until now. The judge requested the original file. Lily, sitting behind me, pulled out her cracked phone with a steadiness I wasn't used to seeing in someone her age. She handed it to the bailiff, who connected it to the courtroom display. The screen lit up with Lily's gallery images, videos, and the screenshot folder she had kept hidden for weeks. The bailiff opened number 87, and this time the courtroom saw not just the conversation, but the entire context, the notification settings, the timestamps, the read receipts. And then they saw something none of us expected, another screenshot Lily had captured accidentally while trying to document the messages. It showed Eric standing near the living room doorway, his posture tense, backlit by the faint glow of his phone, at an hour he insisted he had been incapable of responding. The court fell into an almost reverent silence. Even the ambient hum of the air vents seemed to fade. Eric's attorney scrambled to object, but Judge Monroe held up a hand, instructing him to sit. She turned to Eric again, her voice cool as she asked why the messages stopped mid-sentence and why the reply 2 hours later matched none of his statements. He tried to suture together another excuse, but this time his voice broke in the middle of the explanation. He swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing like he was choking on the lie before it even fully left his mouth. "Silence is only natural when the truth becomes impossible to control," he stammered, as if trying to reshape the narrative through semantics alone. But the attempt fell flat, collapsing under the weight of everything already shown. My attorney requested that the court review the metadata from the screenshot, which indicated it had been taken during a window Eric falsely claimed to be in a different part of the city. The judge narrowed her eyes. She asked Lily directly if she took the screenshot. Lily nodded. Her voice cracked slightly as she admitted she captured it because she feared something was wrong with how her father had been acting, that the silence in the message thread didn't just feel strange, it felt calculated. Her courage rippled across the room, quiet but potent. Eric slumped slightly in his chair, a subtle collapse that marked the first undeniable sign that he understood the narrative slipping out of his grasp. Judge Monroe studied him for a long, heavy moment before marking the evidence as admitted. The shift in the room was palpable, like the atmosphere exhaled collectively. I felt my chest tighten, not from fear this time, but from a slow emerging clarity threading through the chaos. This was the second spike, the one that drove the truth deeper than any argument could. The faint scent of cigarette ash lingered, curling upward as though rising to witness the fallout. And in that stillness, as the judge called for the next phase of questioning, I understood with absolute certainty that Eric's carefully constructed world was beginning to implode in front of everyone, piece by fragile piece, exactly the way ash disintegrates when touched. The hallway outside the courtroom felt unnaturally long, as if the building itself were stretching to accommodate the weight of everything collapsing between us. And when the judge called a recess to allow additional context, I stepped into that corridor with the tension coiled so tightly in my chest, it was difficult to breathe. The trembling key I had found weeks ago, Eric's so-called storage unit key, pressed into my palm as I walked its cold ridges, imprinting a pattern into my skin that felt more deliberate with each passing second. I held it without knowing why I brought it with me today. Perhaps some part of me sensed it represented a door Eric never intended for me to open. As I rounded the corner, I heard voices, sharp, urgent, half-whispered, and I froze instinctively, flattening myself against the wall. The hallway mic installed high near the junction where the corridor split toward the judge's chambers picked up every syllable with chilling clarity. Eric's voice came first, low and furious, slashing through the quiet. "You messed up, Carla. You didn't match the times. She's seeing the cracks." His words were a hiss dragged through clenched teeth. Carla whispered something back, her voice trembling, insisting she had followed every instruction, that she had destroyed what he told her to destroy, that she had covered for him the way he demanded. Her shoes clicked nervously against the floor as she shifted her weight. Eric cut her off sharply, his tone rising despite the risk of being overheard. I took a slow breath, the trembling key growing warmer in my palm, as though absorbing the heat of a truth struggling to surface. Carla pleaded softly, "I kept your secret. You said the voicemail didn't matter anymore." My heart lurched. The deleted voicemail, my deleted voicemail, the one I erased years ago in a moment of fear and exhaustion. I felt my stomach tighten, a cold wave spreading through my ribs as the memory resurfaced. Eric screaming through the phone, accusing me of ruining his reputation, telling me I would regret asking questions about the late nights and the strange inconsistencies at work. I had deleted it because I thought preserving peace was safer than keeping evidence of the tempest brewing beneath our home. Now, hearing Carla reference it, I realized deleting it had only protected him. The hallway mic captured Eric's next words with brutal clarity. If she finds out about the voicemail, everything falls apart. My breath caught in my throat. This was it. Evidence number 5, the fatal line. The truth he feared more than any document, more than the video, more than the timestamps. The voicemail had been a confession of rage he could never explain away if it surfaced. My attorney stepped beside me quietly, his expression sharpening as he listened. He didn't speak, didn't move, just absorbed the implication of what was unfolding. When the judge summoned us back inside, the trembling key slipped slightly from my grasp, its metal edges grazing my knuckles like an omen. Inside the courtroom, the atmosphere shifted instantly as the bailiff reported that the hallway mic had captured a critical exchange. The judge's expression hardened, her posture straightening as though bracing for another fracture in the legal facade. The recording played the speakers, projecting Eric's voice into the space with a clarity that stripped away all remaining pretense. Carla's whispered panic echoed faintly behind his anger, but it was Eric's line, sharp, reckless, undeniable, that tore through the courtroom like a blade. People in the gallery reacted with muted gasps. Eric's attorney paled, his mouth tightening into a thin, flat line. Eric himself looked stunned, as though he had been punched in the chest. He attempted to protest, arguing that the recording was taken out of context, claiming he had been referring to a work voicemail, but the judge didn't allow him space to build another narrative. She focused instead on the phrase itself, dissecting its implications with clinical precision. My attorney asked to approach the bench, and after a moment he gestured for me to join him. My pulse hammered as we stood before Judge Monroe, and I felt the tremble of the key in my pocket like a heartbeat out of sync. My attorney explained the erased voicemail, my deletion of it, my fear at the time, my decision to hide it because I believed confronting Eric would destroy what little stability our home had left. My voice shook as I admitted it, not out of shame, but because the truth carried weight I had avoided acknowledging for years. The judge studied me, her gaze both firm and unexpectedly humane. She asked if I recalled the content. I told her enough, the threats, the volatility, the implications he had tried to cover. Then she turned her gaze to Eric, who looked suddenly smaller, as though the world he had carefully constructed around himself was shrinking faster than he could adjust. Carla sat rigid in her seat, looking at the floor, unable to meet anyone's eyes. The judge allowed the recording into evidence. The atmosphere shifted violently, like a pressure drop before a storm breaks open, because this wasn't just another contradiction. This was Eric confessing his fear of exposure. This was the linchpin. This was the moment the narrative turned. A man's truth is measured not by his words, but by what he tries hardest to hide. Eric's face flushed with panic and his hands curled into fists against the table. His attorney whispered frantically, but Eric jerked away from him, his jaw clenched tight as he glared at me, as if betrayal could only ever come from someone else and never from within. Lily touched my shoulder gently from behind, her silent reassurance grounding me. She had carried so much already, more than I ever realized, and now she watched the consequences of truth unfolding in real time. Judge Monroe recessed for deliberation on the new evidence, but the outcome was already etched into the air. As I stepped back into the hallway, the trembling key lay heavy in my hand again. A key to a lie, a key to a secret, a key to a version of him that no longer had anywhere left to hide. And I knew then with absolute clarity the reversal had begun, and there was no path left for him that didn't lead straight into the truth he had spent years avoiding. The air in the courtroom felt heavier when we reassembled after the recess, as though every breath carried the weight of what had just unfolded in the hallway, and when Judge Monroe signaled for the proceedings to continue, there was a palpable shift in an almost electric awareness that the narrative Eric had spent months constructing was beginning to collapse under its own contradictions. I sat with my attorney at the long wooden table, the polished surface reflecting the pale overhead lights and uneven streaks, and as I waited for the next submission of evidence, my fingers brushed against the glass ashtray placed inexplicably near the counsel's area. It was heavy, old-fashioned, something that didn't quite belong in a modern courtroom. Its thick rim cold to the touch, chipped in a single corner as if it had been dropped years ago and quietly returned to service. I didn't know why it unnerved me so much, but the sharpness of its chipped edge reminded me of the fracture spreading through Eric's story, small but increasingly impossible to ignore. My attorney rose, his voice steady as he announced the introduction of evidence number 6. The courtroom monitors flickered before lighting up with the image of a crumpled receipt, number 441, retrieved from Carla's car. The timestamp glowed in unforgiving clarity, perfectly positioned to conflict with Eric's sworn statement from earlier in the hearing. He had claimed he was nowhere near the location listed on the receipt that night, insisting he had been working late and asleep by midnight. but the receipt told a different story entirely. It showed a late-night purchase of gas, water, and a small household item that matched something visible in the corner of the hidden video Lily had shown the court. I felt the shift in the room, a collective quiet inhalation, as people leaned forward, sensing the significance of what they were seeing. Carla was summoned to the stand, and she moved as though each step carried the potential to shatter her composure. She avoided Eric's gaze, focusing instead on a fixed point near the judge's bench. Her hands trembled slightly as she was sworn in, and when she spoke, her voice had an unsteady cadence, like someone who had rehearsed a lie but forgot the script under pressure. My attorney asked her to confirm whether she had been with Eric the night the receipt was issued. She stuttered, tried to redirect, but her voice cracked when the judge repeated the question more firmly. She finally admitted she had been with him briefly, though she tried to frame it as work-related, offering vague descriptions that dissolved before they even fully landed. Sometimes truth doesn't need volume. It only needs one contradiction to breathe. Eric's attorney leapt up with objections, trying desperately to dismantle the relevance of the receipt, but Judge Monroe overruled him, her patience thinning as she pointed out the repeated inconsistencies in Eric's timeline. She asked Carla again why the receipt showed a purchase at a time Eric insisted he was asleep. Carla gave a halting explanation, something about Eric forgetting his wallet, something about errands he asked her to run, but the story unraveled even as she spoke it. The judge pressed, her voice sharpening. Were you or were you not with him at this location? Carla's silence roared louder than any answer. When she finally whispered yes, the admission detonated through the courtroom without anyone raising their voice. Eric's reaction was immediate. His eyes widened, a flicker of fury tightening the muscles in his jaw. His hand gripped the edge of the table, knuckles blanching as though he were holding on to the last remnants of a collapsing structure. He tried to speak first quietly, then louder, claiming Carla misunderstood, that she misremembered that the receipt was forged or misdated or irrelevant. But his explanations came too quickly, piling over each other like unstable bricks until the entire wall of narrative he'd built began to tilt visibly. The judge's expression hardened as she listened. She asked him directly to explain why the receipt existed at all if he had not been at the station that night. Eric sputtered, his voice straining as he insisted that the timestamp must have been wrong, that the system glitched. But he avoided looking at the receipt itself, as if the ink might burn him. And then the spike landed with a silent precision, the third spike, the one meant to break the story open. My attorney pointed out that the timestamp on the receipt aligned perfectly with the earlier metadata discrepancy from evidence number 3. Eric had already failed to account for the 0317 versus 0402 contradiction. Now the receipt tethered him physically to a location he claimed he never visited. Every thread he pulled unraveled the next. A lie doesn't collapse all at once, it unravels. In the same order it was woven, my attorney said under his breath. And I watched Eric's expression shudder, a rapid flickering of panic crossing his face like a shadow trying to outrun its source. Lily sat behind me, quiet but alert, her cracked phone resting in her hands like a lifeline she no longer needed to cling to. When our eyes met briefly, there was something fierce and steady in her gaze, a strength that made my chest ache with both pride and sorrow. Carla's testimony continued to fracture under questioning. She admitted she had panicked, that she didn't know the timeline Eric had presented would contradict the receipt she forgot to remove from her car. She claimed Eric told her to destroy anything that didn't match his work narrative. A phrase that dropped into the courtroom with the weight of a confession, even if she didn't fully understand its significance. The judge pressed further, asking what else she had destroyed, what else she had been instructed to hide. Carla faltered, trembling now, her facade dissolving. She confessed to deleting messages, throwing away printed documents, and following Eric's guidance because she was afraid of losing her job. Eric exploded, then slamming his hand onto the table, his voice rising with the desperation of someone cornered. He accused Carla of lying, of betraying him, of twisting things. But the judge silenced him swiftly, her tone sharp with authority. Eric sank back into his seat, chest heaving, the illusion of composure abandoned. The courtroom had turned against him not through dramatic spectacle, but through quiet, relentless exposure. The brittle web of timelines and half-truths he had woven finally broke under the weight of a single piece of paper. My hands rested lightly on the glass ashtray again, the cool surface grounding me. The chipped edge pressed softly into my skin, reminding me that some objects bear the scars of impact and remain while others shatter entirely when struck. And as the judge declared that evidence number 6 was admitted and would be weighed significantly, I understood with cold clarity that this was the moment Eric lost control of the narrative forever. The courtroom felt like it had settled into a new gravity the moment evidence number 6 landed, as if the air itself understood that the balance had tipped irreversibly, and when Judge Monroe called the hearing back to order, I could almost feel the floor steadying under me in a way it hadn't for months. Eric sat stiffly at the respondent's table, his shoulders raised too high, his breath shallow, his hairline damp with the sweat he pretended not to notice. His attorney leaned toward him, whispering frantically, but Eric pulled away in sharp, agitated motions that exposed a fracture in his control wider than anything we had seen yet. I folded my hands in my lap fingertips, brushing against the small receipt slip tucked into the file beside me. Object number 9. The reminder that sometimes truth lives in the simplest scraps of paper. As the judge invited my attorney to continue, he rose slowly, pausing just long enough for the tension to coil through the room, then presented the next piece of evidence. Your Honor, this is evidence number 7, he announced, handing a sealed plastic sleeve to the bailiff. Inside was a bank transaction slip partially redacted, time-stamped at an hour Eric had testified he was home asleep. The bailiff delivered it to the judge, who examined it with the same clinical steadiness she had used for every piece of evidence. But this time her brows tightened, her expression sharpening like a blade being drawn from its sheath. The courtroom screens illuminated again, projecting the slip in high resolution. The numbers glowed against the dim wood-paneled walls, a transfer made in the dead of night between one account Eric claimed he didn't have access to and another tied directly to the location confirmed by the gas station receipt. The room shifted. A gasp cut through the stillness from someone in the audience, and even Eric's attorney, seasoned, unbothered, perpetually composed, lost color in his face. Eric tried to speak first, leaning forward with a kind of feral urgency. He said it wasn't his transfer, that the bank must have logged the time incorrectly, that someone hacked the system or spoofed the account. His excuses collided with each other before they even reached the air, collapsing under the weight of their own impossibility. The judge raised one hand, silencing him with a quiet authority that made the entire room hold its breath. When timelines collapse, truth has nowhere left to hide, she said, her voice cutting clean through the courtroom. My attorney stepped forward again, the corners of his mouth drawn into a tight line of controlled resolve. He asked Eric to explain why the transaction originated from an account connected to his tax filings, one he denied having access to under oath. Eric's throat bobbed, a harsh swallow breaking through the quiet. He started to speak, stopped, then tried again, but each attempt sounded thinner than the last. His eyes darted toward Carla, who sat 2 rows back, gripping her handbag like she was bracing for a fall she couldn't prevent. Lily's presence behind me felt steady grounding. She didn't speak, didn't move, but her silence had a weight that reminded me she had been holding the truth long before anyone else gave it room. My attorney pressed further, pointing out that the transfer amount, though redacted, was consistent with the pattern of withdrawals made on nights Eric had been unaccounted for. The judge leaned back in her chair, examining the slip once more before asking Eric whether he understood the seriousness of presenting false testimony. Eric's face contorted a twitch of a panic, flattening into anger as he jabbed a finger toward the projected bank slip, insisting it wasn't what it looked like, that someone else must have done it, that people were trying to sabotage him. His voice cracked, rising louder than the courtroom allowed, and the bailiff took a small step forward, prepared for escalation. Carla's eyes shone with tears. She tried to blink away. She shook her head almost imperceptibly, as if begging Eric not to drag her deeper into the unraveling. My pulse hammered steadily, not from fear anymore, but from the cold realization that this wasn't just desperation. It was the final thrash of a narrative suffocating under the weight of its own deception. I glanced down at the receipt slip beside me, its edges soft from handling, and remembered the night I had found it wedged under the passenger seat of Eric's car, a place he never expected me to look. The timestamp matched the bank slip. The location matched the gas station receipt. The pattern was undeniable. A pattern doesn't lie, people do. I whispered internally, the words settling into the hollow spaces of my chest like something long overdue. The judge asked my attorney to summarize the inconsistencies. He did so with quiet precision. The false alibis, the conflicting timestamps, the fabricated stories, the coerced coworker, the deleted documents, the hidden video, the voicemail he feared resurfacing, and now a financial trail he never expected would be uncovered. With every piece he listed, Eric's face fell further, his posture collapsing as if the truth itself had weight enough to crush him. The spike built silently, a pressure swelling beneath the courtroom stillness, until the judge finally addressed Eric with a tone that signaled the shift into the final stage of unraveling. She asked him one last time whether he wanted to correct his testimony before she proceeded, giving him the smallest opportunity to reclaim even a sliver of honesty. He didn't take it. Instead, he leaned forward, glaring across the courtroom with a wildness that unsettled everyone. He accused me of fabricating everything, of manipulating the court, of turning Lily against him. His voice cracked with rage, spit forming at the edges of his words. And in that unfiltered moment, the man from the hidden video surfaced fully, no longer concealed behind charm or practiced calm. The judge struck her gavel, once the sound echoing like a final warning. Eric felt silent, breaths coming sharp and uneven. The courtroom felt frozen, suspended in the gravity of truth laid bare. I exhaled slowly, feeling something unspool inside me, a tension I had carried for years loosening as the narrative shifted irreversibly. The judge announced that the evidence would be entered into the record and that a final review would be conducted immediately. Eric slumped back in his seat, defeated, his eyes dark and unfocused. Lily's hand settled gently on my shoulder. The moment was quiet, but it felt like the sound of a door unlocking somewhere deep inside me. A door I had been afraid to open until now. And as the judge adjourned the session, I knew without doubt that the final reckoning was approaching, and this time the truth would not miss its mark. The final public scene began with a stillness so profound, it felt as though the courthouse itself was bracing for impact, and when Judge Monroe called the hearing back into session, every person in the room straightened as if pulled by the same invisible thread. The dim overhead lights cast long, disciplined shadows across the wooden benches, and Eric sat rigid at his table, his wristwatch catching a thin blade of fluorescent light that flickered each time he shifted his trembling hands. I watched that watch out of the corner of my eye, remembering how many times I had seen him glance at it during arguments, using time as a shield, using silence as a weapon, using control as a language he assumed no one else could interpret. Today, that glint of light felt like the last remaining piece of armor he couldn't remove. My attorney rose first, speaking with a quiet authority that immediately redirected the room's attention. "Your Honor," he said, "the petitioner calls Lily Hart for the final submission of evidence." A ripple of tension moved across the courtroom. Lily stood slowly from the bench behind me, her cracked phone held with deliberate steadiness, and when she walked toward the witness stand, I saw no trace of the timid girl who once hid behind half-closed doors. She moved with purpose, and the faint fractured reflection of light off her phone screen looked almost like a herald of the truth she carried. Judge Monroe nodded for her to proceed. The bailiff approached, connecting her phone to the courtroom display with practiced efficiency. The screen behind the judge flickered twice before revealing a familiar file name, HVO4. But this time, it wasn't the video itself, it was the metadata screen. For a moment, the courtroom held its breath as the lines of technical information scrolled into focus. Then the judge's eyes narrowed. The timestamp next to modified glowed in stark white text, 10:42 p.m. The moment that number illuminated, the air shifted. Eric inhaled sharply, his knuckles whitening as he gripped the table's edge. His wristwatch slid slightly down his arm as he jerked forward, the metal band scraping against the wood with a metallic whisper. Metadata doesn't lie. It only reveals what someone tried to hide, my attorney said, his voice steady enough to echo. Judge Monroe leaned forward, her gaze fixed on the screen. Mr. Hart, she said, you testified that you were not home at 10:42 p.m., yet your daughter's device shows the video was modified at that time. Eric's face drained of color. He stammered, claiming the file could have been altered automatically, that Lily might have edited it, that phones were unreliable. But his voice cracked on the final word, the pitch rising with a strain that turned every defense into an inadvertent confession. My attorney requested permission to play the video briefly. The judge approved. The screen shifted again, revealing the same dimly lit room, Eric pacing. His voice raised, his expression twisted with anger he no longer recognized as his own. Lily's hand trembled slightly as she held the phone, but her voice when she spoke was steady. I didn't edit it, she said. I recorded it, but I never changed it. He did. The simplicity of her words landed like a thunderclap. Eric lurched from his seat, panic seizing him in a way that stripped away every last veneer of composure. He shouted that it wasn't true, that Lily was mistaken, that someone must have tampered with the video, that the entire courtroom was being manipulated. The bailiff stepped closer. Eric slammed his hand on the table, rattling his wristwatch again. Its rhythmic click against the surface, sounding almost like the ticking of something counting down. I felt Lily's fear ripple through the space, but she did not break. She simply held the phone tighter and met the judge's gaze. The truth doesn't need permission to exist, she said softly. Judge Monroe lifted a hand, silencing the escalating chaos with a single authoritative motion. She turned to the technical specialist assigned to the court and asked it whether the metadata could be fabricated or altered without leaving digital traces. The specialist shook his head. No, he said firmly. Any modification to metadata leaves an imprint. This file shows none. The most recent change was at 10:42 p.m. from the original device. The courtroom exhaled collectively. Eric's expression collapsed. His wristwatch slid farther down his arm as he slumped back into his chair, defeated, his mouth opening and closing without forming words. The judge summarized the evidence, the contradictory timelines, the deleted messages, the receipt, the bank transfer, the overheard confession, and now the metadata that placed him exactly where he claimed not to be. Each fact tightened like a noose, pulling his narrative inward. The tension built toward the fourth spike with methodical precision. The judge's voice cut through the heavy silence. Mr. Hart, it appears you accessed and altered the video with the intent to obscure your behavior. Do you deny this? Eric's mouth opened, but no answer emerged. He looked at me, then really looked, and I saw the moment he realized he could no longer outrun himself. His eyes darted back to Lily, then to the glowing proof on the screen, then back to the watch on his wrist as though searching for time he no longer controlled. Silence engulfed him, the kind that stripped a person bare. Judge Monroe recorded his non-response as refusal to answer. The courtroom's final shift happened in that silence. It wasn't loud or dramatic. It was the quiet surgical severing of the last thread connecting Eric to the lies he'd used to shape his world. The judge ordered the evidence entered into the final record. Eric sagged deeper into his chair, his wristwatch slipping loose, powerless to hold even itself in place. And for the first time since the hearing began, I felt something inside me unclench, not victory, not triumph, but a stillness so absolute it felt like stepping out of a long, suffocating shadow. The torn envelope lay on the table between the stacks of documents, its rough, uneven edges curling slightly, as if even the paper itself had been strained by the weight of what it carried. And as Judge Monroe resumed speaking, the entire courtroom seemed to contract around her words, with the tension of a final verdict forming in the air. Eric sat stiffly across the room, shoulders hunched, fingers digging into the wooden table, as though he were holding on to the last remnants of a collapsing narrative. And for the first time since the proceedings began, he looked small, not physically, but in the way a person shrinks when the truth strips them of every protective layer. The judge's voice remained steady and measured as she summarized the evidence, her cadence unwavering despite the growing emotional charge in the room. The dim lights reflected off the polished wood, casting long, deliberate shadows that seemed to underline each contradiction she recited. The hidden video, the timestamp glitch, the unnatural silence in the messages, the overheard hallway confession, the receipt, the bank transfer, the metadata. One by one, she assembled the fragments into an organized dissection of lies, the kind that left no room for ambiguity or escape. Accountability isn't punishment, she said at one point, her voice cutting sharply through the quiet. It's the natural consequence of choosing deception over truth. Eric flinched slightly at the statement, his throat constricting around a breath he couldn't quite release. I kept my eyes on the torn envelope in front of me, the one containing the judge's initial notes on protective orders and custody recommendations, its jagged opening reminding me of the fractures that had existed in our home long before today. Lily sat behind me, her hands folded, her breathing shallow but steady, and I could feel her presence like a tether holding me upright in the middle of a storm I had once believed I'd have to weather alone. My attorney remained poised beside me, hands clasped, eyes sharp and attentive, as the judge moved toward her conclusion. She shifted her attention to Eric, recounting the inconsistencies in his testimony with clinical precision, how each explanation contradicted the last, how his attempts to discredit the evidence instead fortified the case against him, how his emotional volatility in the courtroom mirrored the behavior captured on the hidden video. Eric stared back at her with a hollow expression, as though searching for a version of himself that no longer existed. The flicker of resentment in his eyes surfaced briefly, but even that seemed to fold under the weight of the truth surrounding him. The judge paused, turning a page inside her folder with a quiet, decisive motion. Then she addressed the room with a clarity that seemed to slice through every lingering doubt. Custody would be awarded to me, protective orders would be put in place, visitation would be supervised, financial discrepancies would be investigated, and the court would not tolerate further obfuscation or tampering with evidence. Her words landed with the weight of something final, something irrevocable. I felt the air leave my lungs, not in relief exactly, but in a profound release of a pressure I had grown so accustomed to carrying that I had forgotten it wasn't supposed to live inside me. Eric's attorney placed a hand on his arm, murmuring something urgent, but Eric shrugged him off, eyes darting between me and Lily as if unable to comprehend how the structure he built had collapsed so completely. A truth denied only grows sharper when it returns, the judge added quietly, and the line struck him harder than anything else she'd said. His face contorted first with disbelief, then with anger, and finally with an expression I couldn't quite define, a hollow yearning for control that no longer belonged to him. The bailiff stepped subtly closer when Eric leaned forward, gripping the edge of the table with unstable restraint, his wristwatch sliding down his arm as if even time had decided to abandon him. Lily pressed a hand to her mouth, her eyes glistening as she watched him unravel, and I reached back, brushing my fingers against hers, grounding her as much as myself. The judge asked if I had anything further to say before she finalized the ruling. My throat tightened, but the answer formed cleanly inside me. I stood, the torn envelope still under my fingertips, and spoke with a steadiness I didn't know I was capable of. I told her I never wanted to destroy anyone. I told her I had stayed too long hoping the fractures would heal instead of widen. I told her fear had shaped too much of my life with Eric, and that my silence had protected him more than me. And then I said that Lily's courage had forced me to choose truth over fear, something I wished I had been strong enough to do sooner. The judge listened, nodding slowly, her expression softening at the edges. When I sat, she turned her attention back to Eric, offering him the chance to speak. He rose shakily, his breath uneven, his gaze unfocused as he attempted to gather the remnants of a story that no longer held shape. His voice emerged hollow, fragmented accusations twisted into pleas defensiveness, tangled with confusion, but none of it formed anything resembling acceptance. He blamed misunderstandings. He blamed stress. He blamed exhaustion. He even blamed the legal system, but never once did he blame the choices that led him here. When he finished, the judge offered no reaction beyond a measured silence. Then she delivered the final order. The sound of the gavel was not sharp or violent. It was steady, deliberate, marking not a punishment, but an ending. The last spike landed quiet and absolute. I exhaled a breath that felt like it came from the deepest part of me, a place I had held locked for years. Eric slumped into his chair, defeated. Lily slipped her hand into mine, and the torn envelope still resting on the table seemed to soften its edges under the weight of a future no longer splitting at the seams. The present settles around me like a quieter kind of air, thinner but cleaner, as I stand at the entrance of our apartment, with the cold doorknob held lightly beneath my palm, feeling the metal absorb a trace of warmth from my skin, while the world beyond the threshold hums its ordinary rhythm. The hallway behind me is silent now, emptied of tension, emptied of echoes, emptied of the years I spent shrinking myself to fit into a version of stability that never truly existed, and as I push the door open, the hinges breathe a soft, familiar sound that feels strangely like reassurance rather than warning. Inside, Lily sits curled on the couch, her knees pulled up, her cracked phone resting loosely in her hands in a way that no longer suggests fear, but a kind of lingering habit she hasn't unlearned yet. She looks up when she hears me enter, her eyes softer, calmer, carrying the remnants of exhaustion but also the unmistakable shape of relief. The afternoon sun slips through the half-closed curtain in the living room, spreading a muted bar of light across the floorboards. But this time, it doesn't divide the room into fractured pieces. Instead, it feels like a quiet promise that we can exist without the constant tightness of anticipating the next breach of truth. I step fully inside, shutting the door behind me, the click so gentle it barely registers, and for the first time in a long while, the silence doesn't feel like a threat. The air warms slightly as I move through the room, shedding my jacket and letting the familiar weight of a home settle across my shoulders. Lily shifts to make space for me on the couch, and I sit beside her, feeling the softness of the cushions, the warmth of her presence, the fragile but sincere comfort of being exactly where we are without pretending. Sometimes the aftermath is just the beginning. Dressed in softer light, I think the words drifting through my mind like a slow breath. She leans her head lightly against my shoulder, not speaking, not needing to, because everything important has already been said in court, in hallways, in the moments where she chose truth over fear. I look toward the window again, watching the sunlight stretch a little farther into the room, scattering gently across the space that once held shadows too sharp to ignore. The shadow narrows into a single line. The motif resolve settles inside me with an almost physical clarity, as if the line itself draws a boundary between what we endured and what comes next. I breathe in deeply, letting my thoughts roam to the courthouse, to the judge's steady voice, to the finality of her ruling. The weight of it doesn't crash into me all at once. It arrives in slow waves, a gradual release of pressure like a knot loosening in the chest after years of being pulled too tightly. Eric's absence lingers somewhere on the periphery of my thoughts, not as a ghost or a looming threat, but simply as space, silent, distant, no longer dictating the shape of our lives. The apartment feels bigger without the tension that once lived in every corner, and I let my gaze drift over the familiar objects around us. The small bookshelf Lily built for a school project, the blanket draped over the arm of the chair, the framed photo of us at the coast before everything fractured. None of these things have changed, but somehow they all feel renewed, washed clean by the truth finally allowed to exist without resistance. I feel Lily shift again, and when I turn to look at her, she's studying my face with an expression that makes something inside me ache in the best possible way. She asks quietly, "Are you okay?" And the question pulls me into the present, fully anchoring me in a moment that feels like both an ending and a beginning. "I think so," I answer, and the honesty of it surprises me. "I think we will be." She nods, absorbing the words as though she's been waiting to hear them for years. Her phone buzzes once in her hand, a notification from a friend, and she ignores it, setting the device aside for the first time since the hearing began. The gesture feels symbolic, like placing a period at the end of a sentence that had stretched too long. I rest my hand on hers, feeling the warmth of her skin, the steadiness in her posture, the quiet bravery that carried us through everything. Healing isn't loud. It's a collection of small, honest moments. I think watching her breathe more easily than she has in months. Outside the window, a bird moves along the railing of the balcony, its shadow drifting across the curtain before dissolving into the light. The world keeps moving indifferent, but consistent, and for once that consistency feels comforting instead of overwhelming. The hum of distant traffic blends with the soft creaks of the apartment, creating an unexpected harmony that grounds me deeper into the present. I realized then that the courtroom, the evidence, the unraveling, they all led to this quiet room where fear no longer dictates the boundaries of our days. I stand briefly, walking toward the window, pulling the curtain open fully until the room fills with unfractured light. The sun warms the space, casting long, uninterrupted beams across the floor. And when I look back at Lily, she offers a small, tired smile that feels like a sunrise after a long night. I touch the cold doorknob one more time, remembering how it felt to stand on the threshold of uncertainty. And then I let it go, stepping forward into a home that finally feels like ours again. The quiet settles clean and steady. And in the gentle stillness of the moment, I understand this is what it feels like when the truth finally has room to breathe.